Saya selalu nonton film gangster.
Anwar and his friends and so on, throughout the movie, they seem to very explicitly say over and over again that they kind of model themselves on these Hollywood characters, Brando, Pacino, John Wayne, and so on. You spent so much time with these guys. Do you think that they actually were influenced by them, or was it sort of like a psychological foil that allowed them to justify their actions?
I think that the question betrays somehow a doubt or a surprise that I also felt. I had to hear it many, many times in the material before I understood, no, they really meant, at least Anwar really meant, that he would come out of movies intoxicated by the experience of whatever movie he just watched, something we can all understand if you've been to a transporting, entertaining Hollywood movie. He would sometimes dance his way across the street if he'd seen an Elvis Presley musical, he says, and kill in ways inspired by the film he'd just seen. And I really had to hear that maybe 10 times in the shooting before I understood that he really meant that, and that he was providing enough authenticating detail and particular anecdotes that I actually believed it.
Tapi bagaimana perasaan Bang Nur melihat adegan ini?
Perasaan itu lepas, perasaan muda itu jauh.
I don't think that enables him to justify in any way what he's done, but what it did enable him to do, and I should say also that if you should watch the longer director's cut of the film, which is now out on DVD and Blu-ray and on iTunes, he talks about government propaganda, which has been, including government propaganda movies, which has helped the killers justify what they've done, even though they know and say they know that the propaganda is a lie. So but I think that what the Hollywood, the love of movies allowed them to do at the time was, at least Anwar, and I say this because I keep saying at least Anwar because I'm not sure any of the other characters really says this, talks about this relationship to Hollywood in that way. But it allowed Anwar, I think, to distance himself from the act of killing while he was killing. Killing is an inherently human activity. We call it inhumane. We're judging it morally there, as we should, but it is human. No other species kills its own with the same gusto and efficiency that human beings do. And yet it's an inherently traumatic activity as much as it's a human activity, and one that, in order to do it, I think human beings need to distance themselves from. So a drone pilot has the benefit of a video game-like interface that allows them to kill without feeling like they've killed. When Barack Obama, in his reported weekly meetings where he would discuss, who should be targeted with in a drone attack, would have the discourse of the lesser evil, saying it's a lesser evil to kill this person than to allow this person to do what he might do if he were still alive. That probably made the act of killing for the president feel like a philosophy seminar more than killing. Similarly, I think Anwar was able to use the intoxication of his the intoxicating feeling of being swept up by a great movie to help distance himself from the act of killing. So in that sense, acting was always part of the act of killing for Anwar.
They were in this society that created this incredibly permissive environment where it was, as you say, there was propaganda encouraging it. They were given absolutely free license to do whatever they wanted. In that kind of environment, do you think that their focus on, well, let's say Anwar's focus on these Hollywood figures was just the most readily available icon or medium to attach to, or was, I mean, let's say there hadn't been movies. Let's say, would they have come up with, I don't know, Indonesian icons or something like that too,
Well, if there hadn't been movies, they would still have killed. The first, Anwar was the 41st perpetrator whom I filmed. The first 40 were, the first 30 were in the countryside outside of Medan. They were picking up busloads of prisoners from army-run concentration camps, going with army escorts to clearings on riverbanks, hauling them down one by one and cutting off their heads. And and the army gave them whiskey so that they could do this, to help distance them from the act of killing. And they were perfectly able to kill without having watched movies. I've no doubt that Anwar would have been able to kill without watching movies, but the fact that the army located the paramilitary office directly across the street from the cinema so that it would be convenient for Anwar to come out of the movie theater where he was hanging out and running his various criminal rackets, come across the street and kill.
So you're saying that the military made a strategic decision, in a sense, in terms of locating the office?
See, I began this film in collaboration with a community of survivors, and they, in the countryside. And very quickly the army told them they weren't allowed to be in. They found out we were talking about what happened in 1965 and told them you mustn't participate in the film. And then they said to me, Josh, don't give up, don't quit, try and film the perpetrators. And I started with village executioners living in small villages. And I worked my way from perpetrator to perpetrator, from death squad to death squad, plantation to plantation, this is a plantation region, up the chain of command from the countryside to the city. And when I reached the city, I found that the army recruited their killers from the ranks of gangsters who called themselves movie theater gangsters, preman bioskop in Indonesian. They were hanging out in cinemas, running various criminal rackets, all sorts of serious criminal activity. They were running out of the cinemas, but they were also selling movie theater tickets on the black market. And Anwar, and when the army paid for and established this the office of Pancasila Youth, the paramilitary movement we see in the film, they wanted it located in a place where it would be convenient for the paramilitaries to be as active as possible. So they put it right across the street from the largest and most glamorous cinema in Medan, the Medan Cinema, where the most powerful group of movie theater gangsters and consequently the most notorious death squad was based.
So from the very beginning there was a very explicit link between the violence and this sort of cinematic atmosphere.
I don't think that the army took into consideration the fact that these men might somehow draw inspiration from movies, not at all. The army recruited movie theater gangsters in the city of Medan because it just so happened that, as in many places, the gangsters were, Indonesian organized crime was involved with controlling the entertainment business of all sorts, legal and illegal. They controlled cinema because that was the biggest one in operation it was the biggest entertainment industry in Indonesia at the time. And the movie theater gangsters already hated the Indonesian left because there was a broad-based left-wing boycott of Hollywood cinema, and not just left-wing, center and left boycott of Hollywood cinema, because the head of the American Motion Picture Association in Indonesia, a man named Bill Palmer, was found out to be to be a CIA agent involved with a plot to overthrow President Sukarno, the founding father of contemporary Indonesia, or the Republic of Indonesia, and they found a coup plot right in his office, right in his villa outside of Jakarta, and this turns out that the coup plot may have been a forgery by Soviet intelligence, but in any case, Indonesians believed that the man bringing Hollywood cinema to Indonesia was involved with trying to overthrow the founding father of Indonesia. So there was a broad-based boycott on Hollywood cinema. And the movie theater gangsters hated this because Hollywood cinema was the most lucrative product at the box office. And so the army was simply exploiting the gangsters' proven capacity for violence and their predisposition not to like the left. The fact that the movie theater gangsters drew inspiration from movies, I think, was contingent on the fact that they were walking out of the cinema and killing.
It's almost like the cinema was like an accelerant or a narcotic or something.
I think it's like the cinema was a narcotic.
As a viewer watching it for these perpetrators, it seemed deeply therapeutic in some way. I kept thinking that to myself as I was watching it. Did you?
Well, I think I very much resisted seeing it that way. Of course, if this were some kind of psychodrama and I were a therapist, my loyalty would have to be 100% to the patient or the client, and that would be Anwar. In fact, my loyalty was 100% always, and actually remains, to the survivors and the human rights community, in dialogue with whom, in collaboration with whom I made this film. And yet I think, and so I think in some ways Anwar and I were collaborating, but for different reasons. I was using each successive reenactment, each more boastful, more grotesque, more lurid, more absurd than the previous, to expose a present-day regime of fear and corruption. While Anwar, I think, was trying to sort of run away from his pain and also, paradoxically, to deal with it. And so I think, and the method was very, very simple. I would show, starting with the very first day I met Anwar, which was an early scene in the film, where he takes me up to a rooftop, shows how he kills with wire, shows how he killed with wire, and then proceeds to dance the cha-cha-cha in the place where he's killed hundreds of people. Starting with this very first scene, I started to do something that I had not done with the previous 40 perpetrators that I'd filmed. I showed the footage back to him. And I did that in part because I had this feeling that his pain was close to the surface. After all, he does something as grotesque, as awful, as dancing in the place where he's killed all these people. Because, as he says, he wanted to forget what he's done, and to run away from it, he would go out drinking, taking drugs, dancing, and look, I'll show you, I'm a good dancer. And so he dances. And so in some sense, his pain, even as he was doing something more grotesque, more outrageous, than any of the perpetrators I'd filmed up to that point, he's doing it because of a pain. And I was curious about that. And I thought, I wonder if all of these men are not necessarily proud of what they've done. Maybe all of these men actually know what they've done is wrong and are desperately trying to convince themselves otherwise, and have then horribly enforced that view in the form of a victor's history on the whole society, backed up by the threat that the violence could recur. And so I show the footage to him, and he watches it, and he looks very disturbed, but he doesn't dare say what's wrong, because to say this is awful, I feel awful seeing this is awful what I did, or even to say this makes me look bad, would somehow be to admit that what he did was wrong. And so instead, I think he lies to himself and to me about what the problem is, and says that it's his clothes, he's wearing the wrong clothes, his acting isn't good enough, his hair is the wrong color. And so he starts to propose embellishments. And the method remained the same. We would shoot one scene, he would watch it, we would shoot the next scene, we would watch it. And the embellishments became more and more outrageous, more and more flamboyant, more and more absurd, as he started desperately, I think, hoping that if he could only make a beautiful family movie of the sort that he used to enjoy in the cinema out of what he's done, he somehow could dispel the horror of it. And in that sense, maybe it's what's fueling his part of the process is actually his conscience, him trying to run away from what this meant. And therefore, it's maybe not so surprising in hindsight that the cinematic recreations become a kind of prism through which he ultimately is forced to see what he did. I think that The Act of Killing is a film about denial and about the consequences of denial, about how we tell stories to justify our actions. We lie to ourselves to justify our actions. And it's a film about the consequences of those lies. You know, we tell the stories to justify our actions not because we're monstrous, but because we're human. And being human, we know we've done something wrong. But maintaining the lies, maintaining those stories, maintaining the myths, maintaining, in this case, the victor's history, inevitably leads to this downward spiral into further evil and corruption, which is culminating really in a total moral vacuum. Because if the army were to tell Anwar, hey Anwar, now kill this group of people for the same reason as you killed the first, despairingly, he has to do it, because otherwise he's admitting it was wrong the first time. And so I think somehow this is a film about storytelling, and cinema is the great storytelling medium of modernity. And I think this is a warning about what happens when we use our most powerful storytelling media as a means for escape, as a means not to see the most painful and profound aspects of who we are. And it is through cinema, in the case of the film, that Anwar does come to see what he's done. I think that there's another. It's both, right? It's both. There's a double. And it's both for him in the film, because he's using cinema, as I said earlier, to, I think, try and run away from what he's done, to escape. But it also becomes the mirror. I think that there's another way that I was very self-consciously placing both American cinema and kind of consumerism, shopping malls. We see McDonald's here and there. This kind of the culture of consumerism, of consumer capitalism. I was very self-consciously building that up and America up as a kind of specter haunting the film, partly because America really supported the genocide with money, with weapons, with lists of thousands of names provided by CIA and State Department officials whom the US wanted killed, so as to say to the new regime, kill everybody. Don't just stop at the obvious suspects. Go after everybody who might be opposed to your new regime and kill them. That was a story that I longed to tell, but understood that I could not tell and still make a film about the present. And the human rights community in Indonesia, the survivors in Indonesia, were essentially tasking me with exposing a present-day regime.
Belum tentu kita sependapat sama pengadilan internasional itu seperti yang saya katakan tadi.
And I knew that I could either make a historical account of what the US's involvement was, or I could make a film about today, about the moral catastrophe of what happened and the moral catastrophe in the present, but allow that vision to be haunted by the United States, which lurks in the wings.
Why the anonymous co-director?
I made the act of killing in collaboration with a crew of 60 Indonesians. These are people, human rights activists, filmmakers, people who, from all walks of life, professors who gave up took breaks in their careers, some of them working for 8 years full-time on this film, knowing that unless there's major political change in Indonesia, they risking their safety to spend so much time on the film, risking their safety to make this film, knowing that unless there's major political change in Indonesia, they would not be able to take credit for their work. They wouldn't be able to put their names on the film. So at the end of the film, in some ways, the last piece of the film is in the story. The last piece of the story is in the credits, where the screen fills with anonymous. The whole crew is virtually anonymous. And it's because it remains unsafe for them to claim they were involved, to be open about the fact that they were involved with making this film. The saddest part for me of releasing this film has been that one person in particular, he was my production manager, my assistant director, my second camera person, but above all, my main creative sounding board throughout the process. I ultimately credited him as a co-director because I felt that creative dialogue we had really shaped the film. It's one of the saddest things for me is that he can't be with me talking about the film because it's unsafe.
Somewhere else you were quoted as saying, this is primarily a film about the miscarriage of the collective imagination that underpins this condition of impunity and open celebration. And I'm just wondering, where does this collective imagination come from? What is that? What are you referring to?
I think I actually was talking about that in the context of the Abu Ghraib photographs, in part, where I was talking about two of the early perpetrators whom I filmed took me down to this clearing on a riverbank and showed how they cut people's heads off with the help of the army, taking it in turns to play victim and perpetrator spontaneously, not at my suggestion. And at the end, after they showed me what they did, they'd helped kill 10,500 people at this one spot. And after they were finished showing me what they had done, the older of the two men pulled out a little point-and-shoot camera and started and asked my sound recordist to take pictures of them posing with the river flowing behind them as they gave the thumbs up and the V for victory in these snapshots. That was in February 2004. I went home to London with this material, really haunted by it. It's where I was living at the time. And in the spring of 2004, the Abu Ghraib photos appeared in the world's media showing Americans giving the thumbs up and the V for victory in snapshots while torturing people. And the big question, it seemed to me, and the one that haunted me in this footage, in my experience in Indonesia, the big question, it seemed to me, is not what violence is evidenced by these photographs, not what torture are these soldiers carrying out, or what killings happened at this spot. The big question is, in what moral vacuum are the photographs themselves taken? In what moral vacuum do the soldiers in Abu Ghraib think it would be a nice souvenir to have them standing there giving the thumbs up and the V for victory while with a naked prisoner on a leash and on all fours at his feet, or these two men posing in the spot where they've killed hundreds and hundreds of people? And I feel that we are all implicated in the culture, the cultural space, and this is what I meant by a failure of collective imagination. We are all implicated in that cultural vacuum that made for those American soldiers these snapshots worth taking. And in a way, it's tempting to see the act of killing and say this is a film about this far-off place where perpetrators have won, and that's really unusual, and they've built this upside-down moral universe where white is black and black is white. And it's interesting as a case study of the potential depths of human depravity. But actually, that's not what the act of killing is about. The act of killing is about the underbelly of our reality everywhere, in the sense that everything we buy comes from places like the Indonesia of the act of killing. I stress this again and again when I talk about the film, because when I say I began this journey in a community of survivors, it was with oil palm plantation workers who were working for a Belgian multinational, and they were making the women workers spray a weed killer with no protective clothing, and it was getting into their bloodstream and dissolving their liver tissue and killing them in their 40s. And they were making oil palm, and they were too afraid to organize a union, in part because their parents and grandparents had been killed for being in a union in 1965, and in part because this Belgian company was hiring Pancasila youth, the same paramilitary group you see in the film, to intimidate and threaten the workers whenever they would try and protest the conditions. And so we buy a tub of margarine made out of palm oil for $1. We buy a little tube of hair conditioner or skin cream for a couple dollars, all made with palm oil. But the real cost of that should be astronomically high, because it costs the women, it costs my friends their lives to produce the palm oil. We pay a tiny, insignificant fraction of the real cost, but included in the real cost that we do pay is a small commission, a small markup, a small premium that we pay, that in a sense we indirectly hire men like Anwar and his friends, goons, thugs, and gangsters, whose job it is to keep people afraid so that everything we buy is cheap. And so I think that what I've tried to do in the act of killing is to draw viewers to a moment of empathy with a man like Anwar through my closeness with Anwar. And in that moment, I think the moral paradigm where we divide the world into good guys and bad guys inevitably collapses. And we start to recognize that maybe we're all much closer to perpetrators than we like to think. And from there, a reflective discussion can open up about how are we all implicated in this? What was our society doing in 1965? How are we profiting off suffering like this all over the world still?
And you have that wonderful quote from Voltaire at the beginning about murder being a crime except when it's done to the sound of trumpets and millions of people die instead of just one, which sort of echoes what you're saying, that we sanction war. I mean, we sanction murder when it's celebrated and ritualized, which is essentially what Anwar and his friends were doing.
Yeah, and it's tempting. I think it's tempting to think that that this is the exception to the rule, that perpetrators win. I think normally when we hear from perpetrators in documentary, they've already been removed from power and they're identified as perpetrators. But I think normally perpetrators win. The reason people perpetrate or commit acts of mass political violence is because it's effective, either to take power or to keep power. And it's effective to take power, to keep power. And so I think normally perpetrators win. Perpetrators commit acts of political violence because it's effective, either to take power or to keep power. And I think what's what's unusual is that perpetrators are removed from power. It's just that that's normally when we hear from them as perpetrators. So the Nazis were removed from power. The Rwandan Hutu extremists were removed from power. We then are tempted to think, oh, that's what normally happens when genocide is committed, because those are the times that we hear about the genocide as a genocide. But how many times has genocide been committed and celebrated as something heroic? Adi, one of the death squad leaders in the film, asks this question quite pointedly. He says, what about the genocide of the Native Americans? American viewers watch the act of killing astonished that they could make a cowboy scene about cowboy scenes, Western scenes, about a genocide. But it's amazing that we're astonished by that, given that the Western, given that cowboy movies is our very own genre founded or invented to glorify genocide, namely the genocide of the Native Americans.
Do the directors of movies, Western movies, or, well, let's say Western movies, I mean, are they part of this conversation? Should there be any responsibility there or accountability?
I think that stories have real effects. I think that, there were the early Westerns that were very simple in their stories and glorifying, the cavalry coming and massacring a lot of Native Americans. There are very few Westerns that get made today, but those that do are often sort of the equivalent of film noir Westerns. They're subverting the original narratives because there is some reflection on the history of the genre and the problems of that history. But I think that I think it behooves us to really examine the stories we tell. And I think it's the function of art to actually invite us, cajole us, seduce us, or force us to look at our most painful truths directly, because otherwise we have no chance, no possibility of overcoming our problems.
One of the guys says, our souls have become like soap opera actors. How keen do you think their awareness was, the difference of their awareness between what they really did and this reenactment, that took place?
Well, I think at some point the boundary for Anwar starts to slip. And I think what made the film particularly painful to shoot was that as the boundary started to slip for Anwar, it started to slip for all of us, because we started to feel we were somehow in the presence of the horror as it was unfolding. It starts as a reenactment, often that the early reenactments in the film are ridiculous. And they become, but suddenly, particularly in this film noir section at the end of the film, and in the longer director's cut of the film, it's really horrifying. That section becomes like a true descent into hell. As the boundary starts to slip for Anwar, and he starts to feel that he starts to feel as though he's really doing it again. I think that it slipped for all of us and was very, very painful. You earlier talked about this kind of lack of empathy, and it occurred to me that in a way, if you've done this, I think you need to be able to at least section off your empathy, hive it off. How can you look someone in the eye, talk to them as you would have to while you're torturing them, and then kill them and keep your eye on them while you're killing them, which Anwar had to do because he preferred to kill people by garroting them, by strangling them. How can you do that if you're allowing yourself to feel empathy in that moment? Does that mean Anwar's a psychopath and he feels no empathy? No. I think his problem is that he feels empathy. That's why he's haunted by nightmares. But he is able to kind of dissociate himself from the or distance himself from the empathic part of himself while he's doing what he needed to do. And I think as that boundary between past and present started to slip towards the end of the process, it became frightening because we felt, well, who is he now? Usually Anwar was the most caring person on the crew, on the set. If someone on the crew fell and skinned their knee, he would be there to really attentively make sure the person was okay. We see another instance of that in the film where he's with his grandchildren and he's trying to teach his grandchildren to be nice to some ducks that they keep. But at other moments, certainly while killing, Anwar had to shut off the empathy. And there's also a moment with, and you talked about Adi being able to say consciously what we did was wrong. It was astounding to me. Suddenly this perpetrator comes in midway through the process and says all these things I've longed for somebody to say, namely that what they did was wrong, and the government should apologize. There should be a truth and reconciliation process. And then when he sees the power of the movie to potentially do exactly what it's done, turn the history, the official history on its head, totally destroy the government's narrative of what happened, and to show that this was awful. When he sees the potential of that, he gets cold feet and decides not to continue making the film and warns everybody to leave the film at that point. Does that mean that that Adi felt no empathy? I don't think so. I think Adi, I've really tried to understand why Adi says that he's in favor of truth and reconciliation and so on, while at the same time not wanting the film to help achieve that. I guess what I've come to believe is that Adi is afraid of losing power. He's afraid of opening the floodgates to justice. And yet it makes him, knowing that what he did was wrong, it makes him feel better about himself in the present, to go through life speaking as a progressive Indonesian would, speaking out on behalf of truth and reconciliation. But when push comes to shove, he's afraid.
One of the most striking moments in the film where, and I don't know if it's, I don't know what it is, whether it's life imitating art, imitating life, or what, but it's when the gentleman whose stepfather died tells the story, and he's terrified when he's telling this, when he's telling the killers what they've done, and he's laughing. He has very nervously laughing, terrified, and then when he gets in the chair and they start to torture him, he's obviously completely traumatized and sobbing, and it's almost like he's acting, and yet it slips into complete reality. Well, the line between fiction and fact just disappears altogether.
After he tells the story, he says he tells the story because he's suggesting to Anwar that Anwar and Herman should use it in the film. And Anwar, they all say, no, it's too complicated, it would take too long, we won't use it. And he says, well, maybe you can at least use it to inspire, to motivate the actors. And I think that's what he's trying to do. He's, like any good actor, trying to draw on his memory of what happened. And it's just so horribly poignant because what happened is exactly what he's reenacting. And you would never imagine a survivor reenacting atrocities, drawing on the real atrocities, deliberately drawing on them to put himself into his role. It's a part of the film that I think is extremely important and that I'm profoundly ashamed of. The truth is, I had a rule that there should be no survivors or victims in any of the reenactments. And apart from Suryono, that's the man's name, I'm quite sure that there aren't any. But with Suryono, he was introduced to me as a great actor and a paramilitary leader. He was actually a member of the paramilitary group, a local leader in it, and an actor in the paramilitary theater troupe. The Pancasila Youth, the paramilitary group in the film, had a theater troupe, and he was an actor in it. And when we were shooting in the TV studio, which is where those scenes that you've just described took place, we would shoot with 2 units, 3 units sometimes. I was shooting something with Adi in one part of the studio, while Suryono was telling his story at the lunch break, so I didn't hear it. And my cinematographer, who's Colombian and doesn't speak Indonesian, was shooting the lunch break, and also didn't understand the story. And I didn't hear the story until 6 months after that shoot, when I was logging, after having logged and gone through the very important scenes, I was going through side conversations that happened on set to see if I missed anything. And I came across this story, and I felt so bad, because if I'd been there, if I'd heard the story, if anyone had told me about the story, I would have taken him aside immediately and said, Suryono, why are you here? Actually, don't tell me. Just stay behind the camera with me for the rest of the day, and then tomorrow, say you have a cold, don't come back. Well, about 2 years later, I had a rough cut of the film. And it took a long time to edit because it was cut from 1,200 hours of material. So I had a rough cut, and I felt it was important to show what had happened to Suryono throughout the course of the process. But I was intrigued, more than intrigued, I was really wanting to understand what he was doing there, what he thought he was doing there. I phoned him. I found his number from an old call sheet, and I phoned him, and his wife answered and told me that he'd passed away 6 months before, but that of illness not related to the violence, complications of diabetes that had been untreated. And I asked his wife, did he ever talk about the film? Why was he in the film? And she said, you know, he was in the film because he felt it was a chance to tell and share with the world the horror of what he'd been through. He sensed that's what the film would help him do. And he was eager for it to come out before he died. At that moment, I realized that he wanted to be there, that he was on a mission, that he made the film much more powerful for being there. And if I'd pulled him out, it would have failed. His mission would have failed and the film would have been less powerful. But if I could do it over again and knew that story, I would still pull him out. He shouldn't be there. It's an error. It's an error of a mission, not of commission, but it is an error. And I regret it, even though I have left it in because I think it's what happened and it's important.
It's fascinating because it speaks to that question of, you know, you talked earlier about how we, the public, always hear about genocide from the perspective of, you know, when the perpetrators have been caught and captured and put to justice. And this is a case where we see a victim attempting to somehow tell the story from within the paradigm of the victors, you know, who have dominated the narrative. So he's like an insurgent. You know.
Yeah, he's infiltrated the film. Yeah. He's infiltrated the film, which itself, in some, given that I said my loyalty was always 100% to the survivors and the human rights community, was itself an infiltration. So the film itself was kind of an infiltration, and he's infiltrated the infiltration. And that's why it turns out, of course, his goals and my goals are perfectly aligned.